Now, you look at Kent Council.
Paul, I'm going to mute you in a minute. You're just going to have to fucking suck it up, okay?
They've come in, I think, probably believing that there were loads of savings that they could make and believing a lot of their rhetoric, and they've just sort of found out that that's not true.
Because 4 reform councillors have lost the whip.
What do councils actually spend money on? Like social care?
Social care. I mean, it's like, it's basically, it's 80% social care, and most of the rest is children's services.
Now, Nigel Farage had promised to root out wasteful spending. 8 councils are allegedly primed to increase taxes next year, including Durham, Warwickshire and Leicestershire.
The core problem of local government is it's funded mostly by council tax, but most of the money is spent on a small number of people.
I think, unfortunately, the quality of services that we're all receiving has dropped drastically.
But I think these reform councils are discovering that problem and realising that a lot of their rhetoric was wrong.
Let me reply. We're running out of time.
It's all right, Brian, you keep laughing your head off, mate.
In the committee meeting...
I mean, even Kent Council even wrote the Home Office saying Labour's policy on immigration was going too far because they didn't have enough care workers. It's like, sure, what do you think your policy would do?
What's left? Back again in the stew. Today with the number 1 most read politics substacker in the country, Mr. Freedman. Welcome onto the show. How are you today?
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome.
So, Sam, you are you've done every kind of great civil service office of state, you could argue. You worked in Department for Education, you worked across Westminster in the think tank world. Believe you were back in Policy Exchange in the late 2000s.
A long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, and then you also worked, I believe, in Number 10 as well.
I've never worked in Number 10, but I've worked with people in Number 10 a lot when I was at the Department for Education. Yeah.
So you worked closely with one Dominic Cummings.
We worked together at the Department for Education for 3 years. And that was an interesting experience, yes.
Did you work with Luke Trill at the Department for Education?
He was after me. He was the special advisor to Nicky Morgan, who replaced Michael Gove. I was a policy advisor, so I was civil servant to Michael Gove before that. But I worked with the special advisors, one of whom was Cummings. Yeah.
Just wheeling it back, Dominic Cummings, this elusive, fascinating guy. How was that? I mean, I think he's almost amazing in some ways.
He is a fascinating character, which is why he sort of gets so much attention. He's gone a lot madder since I knew him. He was quite mad when I knew him, but he's got a lot madder. I think that some of the stuff he comes out with now is really nasty.
Yeah. Shooting down boats in the Channel?
Exactly, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And he never said stuff like that when I knew him. Maybe he thought it, but he didn't say it back then.
You have to repeal the Human Rights Act. You have to state that you're withdrawing from the jurisdiction of the Strasbourg Court. And you then deploy the Navy and you stop the boats. And you say, nobody is landing from any of these boats. Everybody from these boats that we pick up will get dropped on an island somewhere. No one will be coming to mainland Britain of any kind. The boats will be destroyed. And the people organising the boats are going to be put on a list for UK Special Forces to kill or capture.
But he always had this sort of quite extreme personality, very up and down personality. He'd get very hyper, he'd get very miserable and sulk in the corner of the office for days at a time. Wow. But what he was good at, and he was really good at 2 things. One of which was campaigning. He did have a really good understanding of how people think about politics, and I learned a lot from him by listening to him talk about how people think about politics.
Well, he's the mastermind of 2019.
And 2016.
And you saw that in the Leave campaign and the success of the Leave campaign. And the other thing he's good at doing is sort of diagnosing problems with the way things work at the moment. What he's really bad at is coming up with solutions to fix those problems. And you really saw that when he was in Number 10 for working with Boris Johnson, where he made a complete mess of his opportunity to actually do something about all of the problems he talked about. He's very bad at building alliances. He's very bad at winning sort of internal support for what he wants to do. He doesn't sort of understand how to build things. He's
very good at tearing things down.
He's very good at tearing things down, not so good at building them. And his sort of concept of what a good government would look like is almost like a startup. But you can't run government like a startup. It's too big. There's too much of it.
Also, don't like 90% of startups fail.
And startups, sometimes they're amazing and they take these risks and they pay off and you get this innovation. But as you say, often they fail. You can't do that with government. It's a very different type of thing. So he struggles much more at that side of things. But as I say, and then since he lost that job and he was thrown out of number 10 by Boris Johnson, he has got, I think, like a lot of people on the right,
nastier,
progressively nastier,
and a bit of a vendetta. It seems.
Well, he brought down the government. He brought down the government.
He brought down Boris Johnson, which again shows how effective he is at campaigning and using the media and so on. But then, then his own stuff has increasingly sort of tinged with that sort of ethno-nationalist, racist nastiness that we're seeing so much now.
Do you think that people are, because of like the Leave campaign, because of the Boris majority, especially people on our side on the left, kind of lionise? Or not lionise, but kind of build up the cult of Cummings a bit too much? Do you think he just is a person at the end of the day? Sure, he's been quite consequential for politics, but like he really isn't the kind of, he doesn't have all the answers, sort of thing. He doesn't have the answers. He's had the opportunity, and he's failed to use that opportunity when he's been in government. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from him, and there's nothing to learn from looking at how the Leave campaign won that referendum, and he wasn't actually that involved in the 2019 campaign. He that was mainly Isaac Levido, the sort of Tory strategist who ran that campaign. But there is things for progressives to learn from successful campaigns on the other side, but that doesn't mean you have to believe that they have the right ideas when it comes to fixing the country.
I think it's because, I mean, people on our side, there has just been an absence of that political astuteness, it seems, to kind of diagnose what the issues are outside. Disrupt, exactly. Outside of a bit of a programmatic agenda as to what we believe to be the right way of conducting society, there doesn't seem to be that
kind of incisive, cut-through sort of style. Yeah, I think that's what we respect about Cummings, that he was kind of able to kind of graft the world in his own image, sort of thing, and put. And funny you mentioned Isaac Levido there as well. I believe during the 2024 election, Isaac Levido was the only person in the room saying, "Don't call it now."
Yes,
like, can you wait a little bit, Rishi?
I think there were a few Tories who were a bit surprised at how early that election was called, and were expecting it to come later. But yeah, I think one of the problems that the left has is a kind of earnestness that is not very inclusive and is pretty alienating to people who think very little about politics, which is most people. And Cummings and others have been much more effective over the past decade in tapping into that sort of anti-politics or frustration with politics.
Yeah.
Do you think Morgan McSweeney represents a bit of a departure from that, I guess, earnestness worldview that exists on the left? Because I think there are some loose correlations between kind of Cummings and McSweeney around their operations for government and their capacity to get things done. Do you think there's anything in what...
I think there's some... They're very different characters, and I've never worked with Morgan McSweeney. But I think there's some overlap in that McSweeney sort of is also trying to find ways to appeal to voters who aren't necessarily particularly political, who don't necessarily have a very strong and clear ideology, but have a set of concerns that you can see in polling and focus groups. The problem that he has is that the Labour Party is much less amenable to that approach to politics than the Conservative Party is.
Louder.
And some of the things he's trying to do or has tried to do go strongly against the ideological principles of a lot of Labour MPs, a lot of Labour members, which has made him a bit of an enemy. Where the Tories are always, they can be very ideological, but they are more willing to make compromises to get power when it comes to it.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of overlap between the kind of ideological activist-y base plus the kind of non-political is where there's space to grow a political movement right now. And Reform have kind of tapped into that, haven't they?
I mean, if you look at Reform's people who say they're going to vote Reform at the moment, they're getting a huge number of people who didn't vote
exactly
in 24, didn't vote in 2019, maybe did vote in the Brexit referendum. So there's this group of people who are not completely disconnected from politics, who are willing to vote, but are so frustrated with the main parties and the way things have been for a long time now that they're only willing to vote for something very disruptive and different and challenging, and they see that in Farage and Reform. And if reform disappeared tomorrow, they probably wouldn't vote for any other party. Certainly not on the offers that they're making at the moment. So it's they have tapped into something in the same way the Leave vote did, but it's very difficult to do that in government, tap into that vote, because it's naturally a very disaffected and frustrated vote.
Do you think it's plausible that Cummings is advising reform? Because there's some of their policy plans recently have been so out there that they kind of nicely fit into some of the more kind of crazy things that he's been putting out.
I don't think so. I mean, he certainly has. He did advocate voting for reform in the local elections, which I think is the first time he said that. But mainly as a way of destroying the Conservative Party and creating a space in that part of the political spectrum. He and Farage do not have a historically good relationship.
Okay.
He basically pushed Farage away from the Leave campaign because he correctly knew that Farage, whilst Farage has a group of people who really love him, there's also a lot of people who really hate him, and you need 50.1% to win a referendum, and he didn't want Farage associated with it. So he really fell out. They fell out during the Leave campaign. I think they have had some conversations, I believe, but I think what you're seeing now is the sort of policies that we've seen from reform over the summer are coming from a fear of being outmaneuvered on the right by people like Rupert Lowe, who was elected as a Reform MP but then left and set up his own organisation. Those guys were pushing policies that were even more right-wing than Reform.
The remigration
and all of that. And I think, and people like Matthew Goodwin, who are advising Reform and working with Farage, are sort of worried about that and have pulled Reform further to the right with some pretty aggressive policies on deportations and not allowing and deporting people who even have indefinite leave to remain. And then the Tories have been pulled right by Reform moving right. So everyone's being shoved in a rightwards direction.
Can we just tap into that indefinite leave to remain point? Yeah. So just for our listeners, like, what does this policy actually mean in practice?
So at the moment, if you've been in the country for 5 years, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain if you meet certain criteria, and if you get that, you are allowed to stay permanently in the country. Whatever happens, if you lose your job, if you go on benefits, you're eligible for all of that. You don't get all of the rights of a citizen. You can't vote, for instance, but you have a lot of the protections that a citizen would have. You can then apply for citizenship, but not everyone does. Some people, it's a bit of a pain and it's expensive getting citizenship, so a lot of people just say, I've got indefinite leave to remain, that's all I need. They might have been here 10, 20, 30 years with indefinite leave to remain. What Reform have said is that even if you've got that, even if you've had that for 30 years, if you aren't meeting a certain salary threshold, we will deport you. And that is, I mean,
awful.
And it's one of those policies where people wouldn't realise quite how appalling it is until it actually happened. Until you had people who, someone who'd been a nurse for 30 years, had kids, and then, lost their job for whatever reason, and suddenly was at risk of being deported. I think nearly the vast majority of people in this country would think that was appalling. But it's complicated and technical, and the way they've sold it sounds like, if you're not giving to the country and we're not going to, if you're taking benefits off hardworking taxpayers, we'll deport you. So, but I think it's probably too far for most people. I think it's probably pushing up against what even people who are very worried about immigration more generally would accept as being an acceptable solution to that.
To me, in all of that as well, and I couldn't help shake this feeling that it's informed by a sense of kind of racialization, where, I know people who are on indefinite leave to remain, and there'll be listeners, viewers who have that status in the UK and who are incidentally of a particular ethnic group. Is that a fair observation, or is that kind of me trying to find something that isn't there?
No, I think there is an increasingly strong racial element to both Reform and the Tories' language around this stuff. You saw Robert Jenrick talking about
not seeing a white face.
I know.
Exactly. I'm from not too far from Handsworth, and I just thought the comments were so cheap.
One of the worst integrated places that I've ever been to. In fact, in the hour and a half that I was filming with news there, I didn't see another white face. And that's not the kind of country I want to live in. I want to live in a country where people are properly integrated. It's not about the colour of your skin or your faith. Of course it isn't. But I want people to be living alongside each other, not parallel lives.
That's you talking about Handsworth as you went there to film a video. Just expand a little more on what you're saying there in that audio, Robert.
Well, look, I don't resile from those comments.
We spoke about it before. It's around integration and social cohesion and, I guess, multiculturalism. And he just kind of pinpointed it in kind of the most sickening way that disparages our whole community. That has largely been, I think, quite successful around integration because there are so many people in that area.
I mean, this is the frustration about it, is that actually, compared to other countries, Britain is very good at integration. We are one of the most successful countries when it comes to, one of the most impressive stats is that second generation immigrants to the UK in schools outperform the average. Like, that doesn't happen in Germany.
That's right.
Yes. That doesn't happen in Germany. It doesn't happen in France. It doesn't happen in other countries. It is not usual.
Right.
We're doing something well here. This is something we should be celebrating. Like, the country, on every bit of data we have, census data, etc., the country's becoming more integrated. And yet the language you're getting from Reform and the Tories is pushing in the opposite direction.
I think some of this is because, post Brexit in some ways was a referendum on immigration to a certain degree, right? And as we've seen post Brexit with what's been dubbed the Boris wave, immigration is now coming from outside of the EU, and so the racialization and the change of that kind of like salience of immigration from, let's say, a white Polish builder or a white Eastern European builder versus, let's say, a South Asian person. Has amped up, I suppose, the rhetoric of for people who don't really get this stuff, but are seeing the complexion, quote unquote, change of their communities, etc. And I guess it is also true. Like, I'm not trying to justify the rhetoric, but there are some communities where there are some bits of parallel living going on. And that's the kind of thing that, like, the Suellas of this world want to tap into.
And when you do sort of polling and focus grouping around the issue, it's definitely the case that integration is what people are worrying about when it comes to it. People are very worried about small boats and border control. That's one aspect, but they're also worried about integration and the idea that there would be these parallel communities. So it's a powerful fear to tap into, and there are examples of it. There are parts of the country where you do have quite a lot of polarisation within towns, particularly in that sort of belt of sort of former mill towns between in Yorkshire and Lancashire. So it's not that it isn't an issue at all. It's that they're taking an issue in a small number of places and turning it into saying this is our biggest this is our biggest national problem, and it isn't, because of course most people live in cities, and integration in cities is very good on the whole in the UK. And one of the things, so you've got people on the right who are just overtly racist now, and I'll go on Twitter or X, you can sort of see plenty of people just sort of being overtly racist. But the sort of slightly more cunning version of it is to talk about cultures and to say, look, it's not about people's skin colour. It's about the fact that we're importing people from dysfunctional cultures where backwards cultures where they have terrible attitudes towards women and towards gay people. And of course the whole purpose of integration is that people become British over time. And what hits me about when I hear arguments like that is, I'm Jewish, and when my family arrived in the late 19th century, early 20th century, exactly the same arguments were made about them. Like, my great-great-grandparents spoke Yiddish, they wore funny clothes, they didn't seem like they were integrated. You can read debates in Parliament where Tory MPs at the time were saying, these people are alien to our culture, they're coming from backwards cultures. And, like, here I am, 100 years later, no one would think I wasn't English. Integration takes time, but that's the point, and sort of just asserting it's not possible goes against all the evidence we have when community after community after community has integrated when they've been here over a period of time. So I think it's a really invidious argument, that one, really insidious argument, that one.
I would also say that, we're all examples in different ways of the ways multiculturalism has been a success. And now what the right would say is something like, well, you're an anomaly, right? You're not an
you're an exception to
the trend, right? The coordination now on the right on immigration is fascinating. If you go back a year, Rishi Sunak was being advised at the time to leave the ECHR by some people saying that you've got to get a hold on the small boats crisis. The only way in which you're going to be able to do that is by deportations. You have to leave the European Court of Human Rights. He thought it was politically unsellable. And I'm speaking from a Labour perspective, we would have thought that was basically a gift if he'd said that before the election. Now we're in a position where Kemi Badenoch has come out post-Tory conference, essentially kind of doubling down on the reform policy, right? We're going to leave the ECHR, we're going to force deportations, we're going to bring in an ICE-style immigration force, probably using the army, being willed on, supported by Piers Morgan, etc., on Question Time. There's been a normalisation of these ideas.
And also to add, I mean, the ECHR conversation has reappeared on particular wings of the Labour Party, and some of those characters are now in government. So it's not just a right-wing cause or a right-wing issue that is being taken up by these people. I think people are starting to see potentially the shortcomings of the ECHR, but people have different diagnoses as to the problems that are emerging potentially as a consequence of it.
Yeah, I mean, ECHR is something that is coming under attack across Europe. This is not just a UK issue, because a lot of European countries are faced with exactly the same set of issues that we have, where you've got parties of the radical right emerging and pushing very hard on the issue of immigration. Immigration numbers have been very high over the last decade or so, and there's sort of pressure coming to reform it, where because those countries tend to be in the EU and tend not to want to leave the EU, there isn't so much talk about leaving it, but there is talk about reforming it. And a smarter policy from UK parties would be to say, we want to work with all of these countries to actually reform it so that we can get it to a position where we can sort of stay in it and to get the benefits of it, but amend it for the modern world. And I think that's kind of where people on the Labour side of this are sort of thinking about how can we adapt it, both in terms of how we use it in UK law and in terms of negotiating with European partners, because the costs of leaving it are quite high and the complications of leaving it are quite high, even for us no longer being in the EU anymore, because our EU trade deal is based on being in it. The Good Friday Agreement is based on being in it. A lot of UK rights are protected by it as well for British citizens. But yeah, it's become very quickly normalised, this idea of just leaving it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on a podcast this week and I made the case exactly that for reforming the ECHR. The kind of the force behind it, from my perspective, is, as you said, Europe is dealing with this problem the same way we're dealing with this problem. Who is dealing with it well? You could argue Denmark doesn't have a insurgent far-right populist party, but has some really strict rules on immigration that I don't think the left would countenance here.
And a ghettoised immigrant population.
Right. And so there's obviously a sense in which if you kind of give in to the right, quote unquote, on that sort of topic, you can neutralise them to a certain degree. And I'm not suggesting that we adopt Denmark's policies on this, but I think that there's something about trying to sort the problem while lowering the salience. I think it's really difficult when there's 100% salience on all of the bad stories around the ECHR. Let's say the Brazilian paedophile who was a pedo a child rapist in Brazil, fled before being sentenced, was in this country, committed similar crimes here, and then couldn't be deported because of the state of Brazilian jails. You know, when a normal voter, that non-politically aligned voter that we're talking about who really matters, hears that story, they're like,
it's scandalous.
What's wrong with our judicial system?
Totally. And at the moment, if you look at polling, people are in favour of staying in the ECHR because human rights is a good brand, right?
Yeah.
So it's about 50% say they want to stay, 25% say they want to leave, and the rest don't know. But I know, like, I can just imagine the campaign Cummings would run. It would be an easy campaign for him to run because, exactly as you're saying, you just take 20 of these cases where someone that most people would not want in the country has been protected by ECHR, and you just bang away at that day after day after day.
Which is what they've done really for years.
And then the arguments on the stay inside would be more abstract. They'd be like, your rights are protected by this. You know, we need to set an example for the world. And they're just not as emotively powerful as you're allowing this rapist to stay in the country.
Do you think it's the semantics of sovereignty that I think we've become acquainted with over the last 10 years or so since the Brexit debates, where everything has been, to a point, attached to this notion of parliamentary sovereignty, and that has been compromised through our integrations of kind of European whatever it may be. Do you think that has any salience in the narrative around the ECHR? Because to me, I feel particularly passionate about parliamentary sovereignty, and I can see how that argument is wielded. Or do you think it's much more of a kind of cultural one? And going back to what Freddie said, the fact that people are just pissed off that bad people get to stay.
I think if you look at the right, where a lot of this has come from, you know, for a very long time, leaving Europe was the thing that was going to transform the country. And that was partly because it would give us back powers that we had lost to Europe, because it would restore parliamentary sovereignty and we'd be able to take back control. And we did, and nothing's got better. In fact, things have got quite a lot worse. And so you go to the next thing. Okay, well, what's the next thing that's holding us back from wielding power? ECHR, and then you go to the next thing, UN Convention on Human Rights, UN Refugee Convention, but eventually you've left everything, and then you're
It's still shit,
and everything's still shit, and then you run out of other people to blame, or you blame you blame
the enemy within.
But it at no point either with Brexit or with this ECHR debate is there a serious explanation of how asserting more power within Parliament is actually going to fix these problems. Because even if we left ECHR, you know, the issue around deporting, you know, the kinds of numbers that Reform and the Tories want to do is they've got nowhere to send them. And that doesn't go away.
Hundreds of thousands of people
who
they'd have to deport, right? And these are definitely unsafe countries. I think it's worth. You wrote a really great article about where Reform are going. You know, Reform clearly do have a route to power. If we look across the pond, Trump had Project 2025. He had an idea, a policy plan about what they were going to do. Huge document. One that most voters are never going to wrestle with. They distance themselves through the campaign, but then obviously they've come in to realise a lot of these plans.
This 920-page document would usher in the most conservative executive branch in modern American history, if enacted. It's called Project 2025. Its pages offer new administrations a blueprint for executing a right-wing agenda, from purging the government of thousands of civil servants to dismantling the Department of Education.
Now there's talk of a Project 2029 for Reform. Can you kind of give us a bit of a layout of where you think this potentially authoritarian slide for Reform could come in to be able to exact the policy plans that they have in mind?
Yeah, so I've come up with this way of thinking about radical right governments in power and how they behave. And I think there's basically three types. You have what I call chaotic authoritarianism, which is Trump is the perfect example of, where you have this incredibly ideological project that isn't interested in building coalitions, that is very obsessed with loyalty to the leader, that then creates these sort of series of constitutional crises, is incredibly messy, can achieve quite a lot of its aims just through aggression and bullying, but ultimately becomes very unpopular pretty quickly. And struggles to sort of keep things together.
Have we seen that with Trump, though, the unpopularity?
Yeah, so if you look at polling on Trump, he's underwater, and particularly with the key independent voter group, and underwater on pretty much every policy. And really interestingly, you've seen for the first time in a while support for sort of pro-immigration support go up. in America. So this is kind of like there's this sort of theory in opinion polling about sort of thermostatic. It's thermostatic. Public opinion is thermostatic, which is basically just moves in the opposite direction to the government, what the government are doing at any given time. So whilst you have parties that are relatively supportive of immigration, people get more and more nervous about it. And then when you have ICE doing like these horrendous raids on people who've done absolutely nothing wrong, people start thinking, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't want that.
Yeah.
And support starts to go in the other direction. So Trump is unpopular. And you've got Democrats. You don't have many kind of elections outside the main cycles in America, but where you have Democrats doing well, they just won a mayoral election in Alaska, which
and
is
they were like 39 or 40 of the elections since.
They're doing pretty well, and assuming midterms are allowed to run in a fair way next year, you'd expect the Democrats to win back the House at least. So that's kind of chaotic authoritarianism, and you saw it with, I'd say, Bolsonaro in Brazil as well, who ended up losing the following election and is now been sentenced to prison. But then you've got what I call focused authoritarianism, which is much more about how do we stay in power. So Viktor Orban, who's been the Prime Minister of Hungary for 15 years now, has been very effective at taking power, taking control of the media, of businesses, but then using it to basically bribe voters and to reassure voters, but to stay in power. He might lose the election next year, but he's managed to hold on for a very, very long time. So he's not thinking he's using ideology, but he's using it as a instrumental way to build power. In a way that people like Stephen Miller and people around Trump are just pure ideologues. And then you've got technocratic kind of populism, which is what Giorgia Meloni's doing in Italy, which is much softer, and where you're using kind of culture war issues and so on to hold your support in place, but actually being quite reasonable a lot of the time when it comes to sort of negotiating with EU partners or backing off economic reforms that are very unpopular or whatever.
And they do 500,000 visas for migrants as well.
Yeah, and increasing immigration because it's
aging society.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and she's actually remained pretty popular in Italy to this point, although she's got into trouble over Gaza. So there's these different models of how a radical right government can be in power. And what would reform be like is, I think, a really important question if they won an election. And everything that we're seeing from them at the moment is saying they'd be more like Trump. They'd do that kind of chaotic authoritarianism. Farage has talked about, week one, we're going to start the process of leaving ECHR. We're going to get rid of the Office of Budget Responsibility. We're going to start changing how judges are appointed so it's much more political. We're going to get rid of the senior civil service and appoint loads of political appointees into that. All of this stuff just says we're going to trash all of the existing institutions. And if you do that, you create this kind of very chaotic atmosphere where you can still do a lot of damage, but you will also create the circumstances in which you're going to become pretty unpopular pretty fast and create a series of constitutional crises that will be very, very messy. And that's a very different approach to someone like Meloni.
I've got kind of 2 points. Firstly, isn't that what people potentially want because people are quite dissatisfied? And secondly, the constitution we have in this country is such that it could entertain that kind of politics. So is it a constitutional crisis if the argument goes that you're reclaiming authority back to Parliament and elected officials? Because we've had a kind of constitutional democracy that's operated like that in the past, and it hasn't been chaotic. It's been largely quite stable. What would you say to that? Because
just to add to that point as well, like early Labour Party and the Attlee generation were against the ECHR precisely because they were against supranational
and
control.
Against the EU,
yeah. Which I have a lot of sympathy for, if I'm honest.
As a fucking socialist.
So look, I think we need to sort of distinguish between this sort of idea of parliamentary sovereignty and what I'm talking about in terms of constitutional crisis, which is when you push that idea to the point where it breaks. So to take an example, if you did reforms, immigration policy, they're saying they would deport people who've come from places like Afghanistan and Syria back to those countries, and they certainly, let's take Afghanistan as an example. Afghanistan is not a safe country. If you've fled Afghanistan because you've been trying to work against Taliban.
Or work with us, for instance.
Yeah, the idea of being sent back to Afghanistan, the likelihood is you are going to be in very serious danger, that it would be a death sentence. Now, you could pass a law in Parliament saying Afghanistan is a safe country to send people to, in the way the Tories did in the last Parliament with Rwanda. You can pass that law, and under Parliament, under sort of the Convention of Parliamentary Sovereignty, if you've passed that law, judges should accept that. But then it comes into conflict with really historic old common law that people should not be subject to torture, people should not be subject to risks to their life. So what happens then? What do the courts do when someone who is being sent back to Afghanistan appeals this and says, "Look, if you send me back, I'm dead"? They're caught between this sort of convention, very strong convention of parliamentary sovereignty, and this sort of common law that says, from going back hundreds of years, that we don't torture people in this country. How do they resolve that? And I don't think it's obvious, right? They might just say, "Look, Parliament is sovereign. They've said it in a bill. Sorry, you have to go back to Afghanistan." They might try and find ways around it. And then you'll have reform saying that awful lefty judges, activist judges, we're going to start firing judges. Then you start to get a real threat to the rule of law, because we've never had a position where judges have been considered sort of political in this country. Certainly not for a very long time.
Not in the way America does.
Not in the way America does. And if you start to bring that in, and even in America, right, yes, judges are politically appointed, but the president can't fire judges.
No, they're for life.
Here, you could pass a law that said we can fire judges.
Which is being tabled.
Which Jenrick has been talking about.
So this is what's also interesting, that the Conservative Party position is really exactly the same as reform.
So this is not just reform. This is also people like Jenrick within the Conservative Party that are pushing this stuff. But you start this. This is what. So we don't have a written constitution. We don't have a codified constitution. Our constitution is very complicated and messy and all over the place. But you get to a point where you're starting to challenge basic principles like access to justice, rule of law, where we don't have clear rules about what happens in this situation, and it just could get extremely messy. And the example I in the article you mentioned, the example I use is Israel, where is one of the very few other countries that doesn't have a written constitution. Like nearly every country in the world has a written constitution. Whether they obey them or not is a different question. But there's like 4 countries that don't. We're one of them. Israel's another. And the judiciary in Israel has been basically locked in a battle with Benjamin Netanyahu and the government over a lot of these same issues, like what do you do when the government tries to pass a law that seems to fundamentally conflict with justice, and there Netanyahu's tried to take powers to do judicial appointments. So it's a very similar, very messy situation. And before the Hamas attacks of October the 7th, and before the war in Gaza, there were huge protests going on in Israel about this stuff. And, fingers crossed that war finally comes to an end. You're going to go back to a lot of those same problems in Israel. So it's sort of a warning shot. What's happening in Israel, what's happening in America, is a real warning shot to what could happen here.
But don't you think they kind of want that to a certain degree? It kind of compounds and justifies their narrative about taking control. For instance, if the state is an enemy, this is the populist playbook, right? If you look at Turkey, for instance, and how Erdogan was able to gain power, you pick a fight with the institutions of the state, the justice system, you politicize them, you create the crisis where we're on your side, the people, we're trying to do what you want, but the judges won't let us, therefore we must exact control.
So you're absolutely right. Like, the whole theory of politics is picking fights, but you've got to pick fights where you're going to be on the winning side to make that work. And I think you can start to see with Trump, he's picking fights where he's not winning, or where the population is thinking, what the hell are you doing? Like trying to force Jimmy Kimmel off air, like that just looks ridiculous. Or saying that Portland is, a war zone when like everyone can just see it's not. There's nothing going on there. You start to pick fights that look so ludicrous to your non-political, apathetic voter that you start to lose them. And that's the risk for these parties, is that they get more and more radicalized. They have to pick more and more fights to keep their narrative going, and you start picking fights that you can't win. I think there are a lot of people in this country who are incredibly frustrated, incredibly annoyed, want disruption, want something different. But when you start to see judges on TV being fired, and judges actually are pretty trusted still in the UK, which is a good thing. I think that's going to tip over the edge. So, but this is what I mean. It all just gets very chaotic. It's just very messy. It's not structured in the way that we're sort of used to politics.
And does that come down to character as much as anything else? So the kind of at times erratic behaviour of Farage alongside Trump, against what seems to be a bit more of a measured response from Maloney and others. Do you think character has something to play in that kind of potential constitutional conflict?
I think exactly the type of politician these people are really matters. And Maloney, for all that I massively disagree with a lot of what she believes and has said in the past, has behaved in many ways like a conventional politician, in a successful one and a very good orator and all of the rest of it. But she's sort of trying to run the country and make decisions to improve the country, whereas Trump is just, only thinking about his own position and his own sort of narcissism and ideology. So they're very different types of leaders. Farage is somewhere in between. I would say he's not as nuts as Trump. He has more of a grip on reality, but he's also not. He's much lazier than Maloney. He's much less inclined to actually think about governing than someone like that. So
will that push him towards chaos then?
And I think it pushed because a lot of people in the party are pushing towards chaos, right? Like that's where the sort of movement underneath him is going.
Because they've basically just been captured by what's going on in America, really. I mean, we've just transmuted all of those sorts of conversations, that way of prosecuting politics over here.
Yeah.
And obviously the information environment, there is no way to distinguish between those two things, because you get on your feed the American stuff, and then side by side you'll get the British kind of propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys who are hanging around Reform have had their brains completely fried by being on X all the time and just following like mad Americans. Yeah, and they use incredibly Americanized like anti-fat and DEI and phrases that don't really mean much in this country, or certainly haven't until very, very recently. It's an incredibly America-brained way of thinking about politics, and very dissonant with the experience of most people in this country. And I do think that is something that Labour and other progressive parties could be doing more with. The fact these guys are just weird and are saying stuff that is so... might appeal to a small number of online racists, but has no relevance to the lives of most people who aren't spending all their time scrolling on X, and who's might be very frustrated about cost of living or lack of inability to control borders, but aren't obsessed with all this stuff, and to whom it just looks very odd.
Within all of that, then, I guess Reform seems like it is this growing movement of characters and people and ideas. Is there a scope that it could, once it gets to a kind of post-Farage state, become a different model of potential authoritarian or radical right-wing government? So it could begin as this kind of chaotic authoritarian machine and then evolve into something more technocratic or something that British people are more acquainted with. That could sustain it.
It could go in that direction, and then it would be more successful, in my view, as a move, as a political party, if it did try and do that. And you've got someone like Richard Tice, who's basically a Thatcherite Tory, who's deputy leader of Reform, who I think, he's also like, using increasingly radicalised language, because they all are. But I think probably instinctively he would prefer to run basically something that like a slightly more right-wing Tory party.
What about Zia Youssef?
And I think probably Zia Youssef is in a similar position. But those guys are being blown away by a much more aggressive...
radicalised base.
And people like Matthew Goodwin who are using much more racialised language. So I don't see them being able to stop that flow and being able to say, look, let's just govern like basically a slightly more right-wing nativist Tory party. I think they're going to be just, And this is one of the advantages Maloney has, is that she built her party, Brothers of Italy, out of a lot of other existing parties, a lot of quite experienced politicians around her who kind of understand all of this works. You imagine Reform win a majority. You've got 325, 350 MPs who've never been in Parliament before. Haven't been properly vetted, a lot of whom will just be straight up nuts, conspiracists, World Economic Forum is controlling our lives type people. trying to turn that into a coherent, functioning party is going to be exceptionally difficult, even if you really wanted to do it.
But don't they want to do the American thing of like getting all of these GB News commentators and just making them all the cabinet?
Yeah, but again, like those guys, it hasn't worked very well in America. Like people like Pete Hegseth doing their sort of
Secretary of State for War,
exactly, just looking completely ridiculous and winding up all the generals, making all the generals come out from all over the world to hear him do a TV speech. I mean, it hasn't been an effective way of running the country. So I think they would really struggle to turn themselves into a more sort of technocratic right-wing government that used culture war sort of ideas to keep support, but actually attempted to govern in a vaguely serious way. It's hard to see them being able to do that.
So if we consider like Kent Council, for instance, story dropped this week. We're recording this in early October, by the way. I think this will probably go out just before the budget. But there was a story about how Reform had come in, controlled the council, made all these promises around Doge, we're going to slash budgets, all this waste, etc. Then can't find the money that they were promising, and are now probably going to have to raise council tax as a result. I mean, this seems to be in miniature kind of what could happen under a Reform Wales or a Reform Scotland or whatever. In some ways, could you argue that it might be a good thing for voters to see how unable Reform is to govern, for them to make a more informed decision when it comes to the next election?
I mean, it's not good for Kent or any of the places.
No, obviously not for those places.
The places where they're controlling the councils or the mayoralties. I think it's instructive if voters are paying attention. A lot of voters don't pay much attention to what's happening at local level, and distinguish between local and national when they're voting. But it's also hopefully instructive for Reform. Like, you look at Kent Council, they've come in, I think, probably believing that there were loads of savings that they could make, and believing a lot of their rhetoric, and they've just sort of found out that that's not true.
What do councils actually spend money on? Like social care?
Social care. I mean, it's basically it's 80% social care. The rest is most of the rest is children's services. Like, I mean, let's go off on a tangent, but like the core problem of local government is it's funded mostly by council tax, but most of the money is spent on a small number of people who are in social care and require children's services. So most people pay their whatever, £1,000, £2,000, £3,000.
£107 a month, Lambeth Council.
£107 a month. And they don't feel they get anything for that.
Yeah.
Because they don't get very much for that. Most of that council tax is being spent on a small handful of people. But I think these Reform councils are discovering that problem, and realising that a lot of their rhetoric was wrong. I mean, even Kent Council wrote the Home Office saying Labour's policy on immigration was going too far because they didn't have enough care workers.
Yeah.
It's like, sure, what do you think your policy would do?
But how wise is it for us to sit here talking about the woes of Reform because they basically didn't comprehend how politics kind of works or operates in their local authority? Doesn't that just antagonise people to suggest that, well, I mean, not that I'm an expert, but that the experts have constantly patronised us and told us that we shouldn't do X or Y, and we'll just find out for ourselves? I mean, that's what fueled the kind of revolt against the European Union in 2016, and I think has continued to grow in sentiment. I wonder how productive it is. Not saying it's not productive, but how productive is it for us to diagnose the problems in these ways?
Well, I think it's important to understand how Reform are going to govern and how they're going to struggle, if whether that's at local or national level. I think it's also important that the reasons that they would struggle, this is a conversation we just had about local government, are real problems.
Yeah.
And you can't say, Reform have fallen into the same trap as all the other parties. What's our solution to fixing those problems? What's our solution to saying, well, how do we make local government more effective? How do we stop it being people paying this enormous amount of council tax and feeling that they're getting nothing for it? Like, that's where the sort of policy should be coming from progressives, rather than just sort of saying, like, if your argument is only that these guys are going to be even worse, that's not enough, really, in the long term.
But I think the problem is or at least the way in which reform have been so strategic, is that they've seen in this current environment, it's kind of comms first. And if you're a campaigning vehicle, it's just comms. And obviously the way you want it to be is you want to be policy, wants to be upstream from comms and then informing comms. So let's talk a little bit now about Labour, because you've got a really interesting diagnosis. You released this book, Failed State, basically as a warning to the incoming Labour government, as you saw it, that you were just going to encounter the same problems that had essentially killed the Tories. Now, of course, to some degree, there was a level of Tory infighting which compounded their issues, regicide and so on, a Brexit vote that wasn't taken seriously and all the problems since. But there was another thing that the Labour Party, as we were campaigning for it last year, were essentially saying we're a safe pair of hands. You know, you can trust us. We're responsible adults, and that all that needed to happen was a little bit of tweaking, and then government should be able to deliver. Obviously, what we found is that, yes, the problems run so much deeper than we had initially anticipated. And we kind of lack that insurgent messaging that's been really powerful for reform. But now it's becoming more obvious, I think, to everyone that we need something quite radical to change government. So could you kind of explain first, before we go to the solutions, but what is it that is hampering Labour? Why is Labour losing?
So I think I've had quite a few messages from Labour advisors and so on saying, man, your book is I wish we had it earlier. It's very true. Like the fundamental issue that they're struggling with, that the last government struggled with, is a loss of state capacity, like the loss of the inability of the state to achieve certain goals because of policies that have been pursued over 40, 50 years. Of which, you know, I won't try and summarise everything in the book, but probably the biggest is the destruction of local government, which we've just been talking about a bit, and the fact that you don't have what most countries have, which is a tier of government at local or regional level that is doing a lot of the service provision. It does a bit, but nowhere near as much as in other countries. And because we've sort of lost that capacity, that delivery arm of the state, if you like, a lot is the central government tries to do a lot itself, and then ministers and senior people get really caught up in the weeds because they're trying to like run every hospital in the country and run every school in the country direct from Whitehall, and that doesn't lead you to be very strategic, and it leads you to get caught up in a lot of very small scale problems. Whitehall tries to do everything itself, and you get central government attempting to run every school, every hospital centrally, and ministers get dragged into the weeds and are unable to be strategic. But then also they end up getting the private sector to do a lot of delivery, and the private sector is pretty crap at doing a lot of delivery, or at least has the wrong incentives.
But G4S,
the Serco
so Serco Capita, and I talk a bit in the book about a lot of examples of this. The probation service being privatised, semi-privatised, was sort of one of the most extreme examples of
water,
prisons.
Some prisons that were handed out to sort of private companies that then had to be taken back into the state because they were running them so badly. Children's homes, like we are one of the only, as far as I'm aware, we're the only sort of developed country in the world where the state doesn't run children's homes. They're run by private companies for huge profits. The average amount it costs for a children's home place is £6,000 a week.
That's insane.
And it's
also completely reliant on migrant labour as well.
Yeah, and it's sort of breaking the finances of councils who have to pay for these places. The impact
it's having on kids.
The impact it's having on kids is horrendous. Like either the state should be running them directly, or it should be working with social enterprises.
Well,
to run
this
them.
is it. Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next point. Is that actually social enterprises up and down the country are picking up for where the kind of Serco economy is failing, and the government isn't rewarding that appropriately.
Right, and the way I don't want to bore your listeners by talking about procurement too much, but the way
I spend a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, the way government procurement works is it favours the big companies who are able to deal with these very complicated processes, not smaller
because of
social
lobbying.
enterprises. More because they are trying to put in place ways of getting value for money for the taxpayer, but the way they do that is by creating these incredibly complicated processes where if you're Serco and you can hire a whole team of people who literally do nothing but do these bids all the time and have got really good at it, you'll win. And if you're like three guys trying to run a social enterprise, you get screwed every time. So you have this huge state capacity problem caused by the sort of loss of state capacity at local level. When central governments tried to step in, made a mess of it. Private companies being funded to do it, making huge profits. So you actually need to think about how do we rebuild that capacity. And that's a huge issue. And I don't think Labour had really thought very much about that before the election. And now they're sort of, a year in, it's a bit late.
I mean, just turning to that quick social enterprise point, that is a bit of a silver bullet, I think, that the government could embrace.
Can you explain what social enterprise is?
Yeah, so, I mean, ordinary businesses, and I say someone put it to me, they're venture socialists instead of venture capitalists. They're businesses that do something good for community and pick up, I think, a lot of the shortcomings of the state. And all of that profit then goes back into the business, ensures that people can be recognised in trade unions or on living wages, employs people who have been ex-offenders or people who may not have particular qualifications, a whole range of people who have been left behind within the system. Social enterprises pick up. And they really solve a lot of community issues. And if the government were to embrace social enterprises a lot more effectively in the delivery of key services where local authorities have been completely stripped, not only would you get kind of a sense of community uplift, it would be cheaper for the state and you'd get kind of more resilient and more effective public services for ordinary people just to consume and engage with. So I don't know why the government hasn't really picked it up. I mean, you may have more insights to me, but especially with the children's residential care and a whole range of other things, this is something that I think a government could embrace a lot more effectively to solve some problems.
And I think you're starting to see examples of it, but not necessarily at national level yet. So the Greater Manchester mayoralty, Andy Burnham's mayoralty, and his team have set up.
Are you allowed to mention that name?
Yes. I
think you're allowed to mention that
when he's
name.
not busy campaigning to be leader of the Labour Party. His team have set up this initiative where they're setting up their own children's homes in Manchester, and then local authorities are bidding in for places into them. You're seeing a few examples of that kind of thing happening around the country. At a national level, the new minister who's covering this issue is a guy called Josh McAllister, who wrote a great report for the last government, arguing for a lot of the right changes, and he's now in a position where he could do this. He genuinely understands the issue, and he cares about the issue. So I'm hoping he gets sort of the support and permission to really drive on it. So there's a bit of hope around it.
And Georgia Gould was quite good.
And Georgia Gould is also good on this stuff as well. But it's just hard to change the culture of departments that are naturally very centralising and if they are going to commission out, they want to commission with one big organisation because it's easier for them to do that. It would take a very serious push, a reforming push to change that mentality, and we haven't seen that kind of thinking yet.
Do you think Whitehall overestimates its ability and just likes having power, or do you think it's just consumed too much over time?
Yeah, so I think you have a number of different drivers. For ministers, as well as civil servants, if you're going to be blamed for the failure of a service, it's natural to want to have power over it. If you're going to be blamed if a school, roof falls in, you want to have the power to stop that from happening. But the problem with that is that you bring more and more power into the centre, and then you get overwhelmed. You can't actually effectively use it because you can't be thinking about every single school in the country, every single hospital in the country. But it's a natural instinct to want to have the power if you're going to get the blame, and if you devolve that power then you still get yelled at. It doesn't feel fair. There's also, I think, in departments a contempt for local government a lot of the time, not always, obviously not generalise about every civil servant, but I think there is a lot of sort of sense of we're the best and the brightest, and
we're the Oxbridge graduates,
and local government's pretty poor in terms of the quality of people it attracts and so on, which isn't always true for a start. But also is a bit chicken and egg to the extent it is true. Like if you're not going to give them any power, then you're not going to get great people to want to work there. So that at some point you have to have a bit of a leap of faith and say the only way to make this work is by devolving down delivery of services, and by doing that you'll create the conditions where good people will want to work there. and to stop being so contemptuous, because actually, look, the record of central government is hardly amazing on this stuff, right?
No.
Do you think there's something to be said about economic devolution as well, not just the kind of political devolution, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical. If you look at the mayoral model at the moment, I think there's been some really positive aspects of it, but they're also supplicants to central government. You know, you look at someone like Burnham, someone like Andy Street, who was the Tory mayor in the West Mids. It's quite easy for them to be popular just by saying, well, everything good that happens, well, that was me. But everything bad is because the government won't give me any money. So what am I supposed to do? It's the evil Westminster lot. And that was part of the issue with devolution in Scotland, was the SNP were able just to say, well, anything good, that's us. Anything bad, Westminster. And that's because all their money does come from central government. They're reliant on central government funding. If you say to them, actually, you guys now have the power to raise taxes in your area, suddenly it's
your responsibility.
And that's really important. It also means you can pick the priorities. You know, there's a kind of cynical aspect to it, but there's also a positive aspect, which is if you're mayor of Manchester or Liverpool or wherever, at the moment, you get money to do things that central government wants you to do. You might think, this is a huge priority. This is, I really want to do something working with schools in Manchester. You don't have it. You don't have any money for that, and you have no ability to raise any money for that. You should be able to say that. You should have the power to do that. So I would start by allowing mayors to raise a tourist tax, saying that you can charge kind of £2-3 for everyone staying in a hotel in your area. That would bring in a decent chunk of revenue that they could start to use on their priorities. Not politically difficult, because no one in those areas is paying the tax.
Yeah.
It's only tourists paying the tax. And then start to build on that with looking at things like retaining more of council tax and other kinds of ways of doing property tax, local sales taxes, which get more complicated, but you start to make decentralisation really meaningful. And we're very unusual in the fact that nearly all tax is collected by the centre in this country. Very few other countries do that.
Sam, it feels like there's a critique here about centralisation, but there's also kind of a level, kind of maybe a hidden critique about privatisation as well. And post-Thatcher, we've got so many industries we can name off the top of our heads that have been privatised, and now we're seeing the problems with it. I think water's quite a good one as a way in. We haven't built a new reservoir since the 90s. People are asking the question, why has water not been brought back into public ownership? And presumably the answer is because it's actually just too expensive for the government to bring it in.
And the infrastructure is just so terrible.
Yeah, so... when water's a really interesting one, because it was privatised under Thatcher, and since then private companies have made a lot of money out of it. They have also invested about more than was being invested before. And the problem with nationalising water, firstly, it's very expensive because you've got to buy back all the infrastructure. But secondly, you then have to pay for the infrastructure, and there's no indication that we would have the money to be able to do that.
What's the ballpark figure are we doing on that?
So in terms of buying it all back, I believe it's something in the order of 70 billion. It's a serious chunk of cash.
Yeah.
But then you've also got to, as you say, the infrastructure's not great. So you'd have to sort of build it back up. So it's very tricky. So once you've done these things, it's very tricky to undo them. Compared to rail, where actually we never gave away the basic infrastructure, so it's been much easier for Labour to come in and renationalise the rail, because all we were doing were giving franchises to run
contracts, right?
Yeah.
It was contracts. So you just, when those contracts end, you just take it back.
Yeah.
But
that's why it's easier for the Secretary of State to nationalise effectively.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas water, electricity, gas would be really, really hard.
So something I've long thought about in terms of that crisis with water, or for example British Steel that was recently nationalised as well, is, and this is just an idea, I'm curious what your thoughts are. Imagine if the state only nationalised 50% of it, and then 50% of it were co-ops, local people, local businesses who were able to run the infrastructure, who were able to fix the infrastructure, and who were able to sell it on then for a profit. So that money that is accumulated goes back into the business, goes back into the community, and is a kind of self-sustaining thing, whilst the state can operate maybe a more bureaucratic role of the administering of water around the country or something. Would that be an effective solution? Because co-ops and mutuals and that kind of style of economy has always been within the tradition of labourism and a concept of the working classes in this country. Could that not be a feasible solution instead of wholesale
I think if you were
nationalisation?
starting from scratch, like starting again, the best solution would be to say we're going to have non-profits running it rather than either the state or for profit, because they would, they'd still have incentives to improve services, but they wouldn't be paying out huge dividends to shareholders. But it's very hard to get from where we are to something that looks like that, or co-ops or anything, because you have to buy. The owners of this stuff are the for-profit companies now, and you have to buy it back somehow or another. And it's just very difficult to figure out how you do that, especially when we've got we're so economically constrained at the moment. If we would, had loads of money lying around, you could do it, but we don't. So I would be focusing less on water, electricity, gas, and more on things like children's home, which is a much smaller sector, or social care, which is again mostly run by for-profit companies, and trying to just gradually increase the number of state-run and social enterprise-run.
So you have like good case studies, and then you can build up a bit more capital, and then be able to move. Okay.
And ultimately, that will save you money for a little bit of upfront investment, because you won't have to be paying out this £6,000 a week for a place. Yeah.
There's a great narrative there for Labour, though, isn't there, about kind of returning to socialist roots in a way, and returning power to people, and it feels like it's part of that rewiring of the state thing that needs to happen as well.
And one of the frustrating things about the way our sort of political world uses opinion polling is, like, when you've got majority of people saying they're worried about immigration, that's the biggest story ever, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's been support for nationalisation in polling for decades.
Yeah.
No one ever mentions that. We're very quiet about that bit of opinion polling.
People love it when we say stuff about nationalisation.
Well, because people want it. People want to know that the state can deliver something. I think where the state is eroding entirely around them, people want to know the government can actually administer something good that people need.
I mean, I think if you look at the polling, 30% of the population would be in favour of nationalising supermarkets, which I'm not proposing. But like,
okay,
which I'm not proposing, and I don't think it would be a good idea. But like, it just shows that sort of underlying support.
Well, I think you want to have a sense of like buy-in.
And there's an incredible and often justified cynicism about the behaviour of big businesses. And this is one of the areas where I think Labour's got really strategically caught, because on one hand they've been trying to appeal to that frustration with things like better workers' rights, with nationalising rail, minimum wage, but they've been very scared about talking about any of that stuff because they don't want to piss off big businesses, because they're so worried about growth in the economy. And you can kind of see how they've got caught between those two stools, but it means they're not getting the benefit of either. Everyone just is annoyed with them.
To me, that began in opposition when the Labour Party claimed to be a pro-worker, pro-business party, where, I mean, anybody, I think, who's read any basic political science, as you said, has to pick a side.
Yes.
How, in a kind of capitalist economy, can you be pro-worker and pro-business and then kind of tread this really gentle line between doing all of this stuff on, for example, the Employment Rights Bill or renters reform, and then slap on high national insurance?
You're trying to play both sides, and you just end up pissing everybody off. Like, there was a bit in Keir Starmer's conference speech where he was sort of attacking the globalisation and was incredibly critical of globalisation, which is sort of fits into this sort of anti-big business theme. Like, literally the week before, they'd been boasting about getting like £100 billion of investment from massive US corporates. Like, what do you think globalisation is? It's that.
But that's the irony, is that even the Trump lot, when they say they're anti-globalisation, they're literally they're pro these huge corporations. They're pro the AI revolution.
They're pro globalisation of capital and anti-globalisation of people. I mean, that's how it plays out.
The problem is that the poorer countries have now got a better deal. You know, JD Vance literally said that explicitly, right? Like, there has been some equalising on the global stage, and that wasn't meant to happen. Whilst inequality's grown inside the US, it was still meant to kind of lift up the bottom of them, but no one else. No one else was meant to succeed.
It hasn't succeeded on their terms.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is an interesting way to kind of talk a bit about Labour's struggles electorally. We're talking a bit about how we don't know whose side they're on a lot of the time. They say working people, pretty amorphous.
Nebulous phrase.
Yeah, exactly. And you've written a little bit about this strategically, but I think there's something that I guess a lot of people are missing at the moment, which is just a sense of the kind of economic crisis that we're living in globally, right? The reason why even in Europe, which might have in some places, policies and strategies that we wish we had here,
exactly.
They're still struggling as well. I mean, how much do you think that we are living right now through an economic crisis, and that the kind of revolution to it's actually being led more by the radical right?
I mean, we've had a stagnant economy since the financial crisis. The financial crisis, I've argued, is sort of like almost like our First World War. It changed the world. It changed everything about the world, and so many things that are now wrong with the world can be you can pin back to the financial crisis 2008. America has recovered better from it, partly because they have the tech companies that have.
And the reserve currency.
And they're the reserve currency of the world. It still hasn't necessarily benefited
normal people
and low-income Americans, but in terms of their overall economic growth, they've sort of recovered back to where they were. But Europe hasn't at all.
Is that arguably from policies around austerity and shrinking the state to the way that it has been?
Yes, I think it's partly because, unlike America, unlike China, Europe and UK in particular did a much smaller kind of stimulus after the financial crisis, and instead went more towards austerity and trying to immediately cut spending, which was a mistake. It's also been heavily affected by the war in Ukraine, which has hit energy costs hugely in Europe in a way that hasn't happened in America and China and so on.
And COVID.
That's
what I mean, though. These four black swan events.
This has really hit Europe across the board. German economy's been in real trouble the last few years. French are in a total mess. Can't get a government together. Can't get a budget together. This is not a UK specific problem. But voters in every one of those countries don't think of this as an international. Voters think about their own country, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You're the leader of our country. I don't care what's going on in France. Sort it out. But we are caught by a lot of these global winds, and it could get worse. I mean, you're going to put this out a little while after we've recorded it. Maybe the AI bubble will have burst by that point.
Well, you're seeing all the news companies. I mean, we've been posting about this for months, but all these AI companies are inflating each other's value.
Totally, and at some point there's going to be a correction, and that's going to be pretty. And it could come quite soon. You never know with these things. And that's going to have another sort of knock-on effect on the global economy. Obviously, Trump's tariffs are hurting. So it's less an immediate crisis like 2008 and more just a sort of constant ongoing struggle to get anywhere near back to where we were before the financial crisis. And nobody has come up with a way of doing that. And that's kind of one of the reasons why the radical right don't have an answer to any of these problems, but at least they have an answer to a different problem, or sounds like they have an answer to a different problem. So people sort of turn to them as a sort of way out. But nobody's got a coherent theory of how you get countries like the UK, France, Germany back to 2.5-3% growth a year. And until you do, we're going to have pretty grim politics.
It seems like the right's response to it is to create their own kind of set of problems that explain away the economic crisis.
It's immigrants,
right?
it's disability benefit. And even if you did all the most horrible things you could do on all of those things, it's not going to solve your growth problem.
I also think there's an irony that obviously now that they've managed to create this white working class base, as part of their voter coalition, that there's actually a socialist undercurrent to those people. When they often talk about, we don't take care of our own before these other people. What they're talking about is a better redistribution and lifting up of the worst off in society, which is traditionally kind of the thing that tapped us into politics on the left, right? So I think what's really interesting is kind of how inequality fits into that picture. Obviously, you've got people like Gary Stevenson who are basically maybe being a bit hyperbolic about how bad inequality is, but it's clearly a problem.
And a very simplified response
solutions
to the solution to the problem.
But do you think that inequality, do you think that is what Gary Stevenson has shown, though, is that the left could build out from this inequality piece as a way to kind of unite the left and win over some of these non-political audiences as well?
I know we don't agree on everything, but let's find the thing that we do agree on and let's fight for that. Because those people at those protests, they, just like you, are struggling to pay the rent, their kids are struggling to pay the rent, they're struggling to find economic futures. If you centre that, if you focus on that, you can build something positive, you can win them over.
I mean, this takes us back to the sort of confusion within Labour about who the enemy is and whose side they're on. Like, you could rebuild the voter coalition that Labour won the 24 with and even add to it on a very strongly economic populist argument. But big businesses
will hate that.
Will absolutely hate that.
And is it electable?
I think it probably would be electable, but you would be constantly being attacked as harming the economy.
They are anyway, though.
But they are anyway. But that is the one thing that ties together continuing loyal Labour supporters, people who've defected to the Greens, people who've defected to Reform, is they're all attracted by an economic populist message. Where they differ is on social issues and authoritarianism and immigration and so on. So you absolutely want to pivot to the economy if you want to hold that coalition together. The problem Labour have is the economy isn't doing very well either. And they're going to have a horrible budget and et cetera, et cetera. So if they could find a way to get a little bit of economic stability and start to build on that, that would be, and to push the argument that reform are just in the hands of big businesses, that the Tories obviously always have been, then you could start to see them forming a narrative.
So you think there's room for economic populism once the economy is stabilised?
I think they're just going to be too scared to do it now because they're so worried about investment into the UK and our complete lack of growth. And I get that, right? It is a huge problem. And you really don't want a lot of companies who might be about to invest in the UK to go, oh, wait a minute, we don't like the sound of all of this, we're going to put our money into France instead. So I get why they're worried about it, but it's the only enemy they've got that works for their voter coalition.
So you're basically saying the problem is, can you do economic populist messaging without frightening the bond market, essentially?
Right, and I'm not sure you can, right? I'm not sure there is a way
Can you explain for listeners a bit about how the bond market and bond vigilantes are really kind of determining not just our politics, actually, but all over the globe, what their decision making is?
Yeah.
How it's gridlocked Rachel Reeves.
Yeah. Governments need to borrow a huge amount of money. Every government, pretty much, not quite every government, but most governments have to borrow money. We're borrowing a huge amount of money every year, hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds. The people who lend that to us are buying bonds, government bonds, and they're a mix of different types of organisations who buy those, like banks, pension funds, individuals, etc. But if they're not willing to buy that debt, you are absolutely fucked as a country.
Yeah, right.
Because if you can't sell your debt, you have to put the interest rates higher and higher and higher to sell that debt. You have to pay more and more interest on that debt, and it just cascades into a position where eventually you just go broke. And have to be bailed out or etc., which happens in the developing world
all the time,
from time to time. Doesn't tend to happen, or hasn't happened in recent years to any rich country, apart from Greece after the financial crisis. So that's the concern. But even if you don't get to the point of being bailed out, the having to pay higher and higher interest rates on your debt really harms your ability to do anything positive. We're spending well over 100 billion quid this year on debt interest. That's not what you want to be spending your money on as a country.
That's just interest.
That's just interest on the debt, right? That's because we're borrowing so many trillions of pounds that just the interest is.
And who's that money going to?
Banks, pension funds, any individuals. If you've got premium bonds, you. So it goes to a lot of different people. But that is that interest is the risk they're taking for holding British government debt, effectively. So so you, as a government, you're aware of this, and you have to pursue policies that try and keep that interest rate that is being paid on your debt down as much as possible. And if Rachel Reeves came out of the budget and said, "Screw it, I'm spending another 100 billion quid on all of these important things that we need," the bond markets would freak out.
Yeah.
Suddenly, your interest rate goes. It's about 4.7% interest we're paying on 10-year bonds at the moment. It would go 6-7%. I mean, it would just destroy,
which is higher than we were paying under Truss, right? Even after that shock,
it would destroy the government's ability to do anything. So bond traders have this huge, and it's not coordinated. It's not like there's a bunch of people sitting around a table like bond style, rubbing their sort of hands together and thinking, how can we screw the government over? It's just the way markets work. That if people are scared of the risk around a government's ability to manage its own finances, they will charge more interest to hold debt.
Do you think there's any credibility in the argument that if, to a point, independence of the Bank of England was to be compromised and returned to the authority of the Chancellor, or at least the Chancellor could sit at the Monetary Policy Committee and have a vote on interest rates, could that sway it, or is it just too embedded? I think
that would at the moment be quite damaging. People would see that as a political intervention against good fiscal policy, and that would push the cost of borrowing up. And be quite damaging. And the interest rate that the bank set, that we all pay on our
2.5%.
Oh yeah, it's 4%.
4% now, but the aspirations are
is not what the government has to pay. I mean, that they're sort of not necessarily related figures. So even if the bank said we're bringing interest rates down to 2%, it doesn't mean the bond market interest rate would fall. It might even go up because they think that was a bad economic policy. So the government has very few levers other than trying to convince people who lend to the UK that they're serious about getting our fiscal policy on track and not going back, not spending so much money that we can't cope with debt in future years.
And you laid out in your most recent article about a few different ways the government could go about doing the budget. Well, Rachel Reeves can go about doing raising taxes in the budget. Could you lay out for us briefly what you think the best course of action is, but then what you think the likely course of action is? And obviously, we can measure you.
Best is a relative thing when you're talking about what will be a very difficult budget. Rachel Reeves has signed up to a set of fiscal rules which are measured by the Office of Budget Responsibility. We will see what happens, but they are likely to say she needs to find somewhere between 20 and 40 billion pounds to meet her fiscal rules. It's very difficult for her to cut spending. They might try and cut spending a little bit in a few places to try and help meet that target. But we've just had a spending review, so there's not much scope for cutting more spending quickly. She will also try and convince the Office of Budget Responsibility that they're doing some policies around planning and stuff that will help growth, and that might help a little bit with that number. But ultimately, a lot of it's going to have to come from tax. And in an ideal world, the easiest way of doing that would be to raise income tax across the board, so for every level of income tax. And you could raise about 20 billion quid just through 2p on income tax. But of course, they pledged not to do that at the election. And it's pretty, given all we've been talking about, trust and everything else in political parties, breaking your biggest electoral pledge is a pretty tough thing to do.
Yeah.
And, not a great, I don't think they should ever have made that pledge. I think it was a stupid thing to do, but having made it, it's quite hard to break it. What you could do is just try and survive, find a load of kind of fairly small taxes that, taxes on banks, taxes on rich people trying to leave the country, taxes on long-haul air flight, which don't affect most people, and you kind of probably get away with politically, and you sort of just about get through it. Or you could say, we actually want to give ourselves a stronger narrative to sell this sort of package and to build a bit of a base of more revenue for the longer term by saying that you're going to make changes to income tax, but you're going to do it in a way that doesn't hit working people. So you are technically breaking your pledge, but you're doing it in a way that you think is sellable. So the Resolution Foundation, I think, is a think tank, came up with this idea of, you say, we're going to put 2p on income tax, but we're going to take 2p off national insurance.
Right.
And what that does is, if you're an ordinary person who's getting a pay packet every month, makes no difference to you. 2p, it just nets off against each other.
But if you're a pensioner,
you're paying more.
2%
If you're a landlord, you're paying more.
Yeah.
If you're self-employed, you're paying more. So you're hitting groups that
aren't those all the people who, like, the Tories basically ring-fenced and protected for years?
So there's a really good economic argument for hitting those groups, because they have all been protected unfairly, whereas your sort of average person hasn't been. But pensioners vote.
Pensioners vote in a 2-to-1 ratio compared to young people.
And, self-employed people get very upset when you raise the taxes more than employed people, even though it would be justified rationally. So it would be politically more risky, but it would be a clearer argument, and would allow you to raise that bit more money that you could then say maybe would reassure the bond markets, but would allow you to do a couple more positive things, rather than it just being about tax rises. But we will see whether they're willing to take those risks. My guess, and I hope I'm wrong, is that they'll just take the survival route and just try and get through it with a few smaller taxes as best they can.
And all of that, she has to get through her own MPs on the backbenches as well, which
Absolutely.
is at times
proved difficult so far.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're increasingly fractious and increasingly annoyed. So that also just sort of pushes you towards doing the survival and just getting through it. But then you've missed an opportunity maybe to create the space to do something more next year. And if you just raise just about enough to survive, then you could just be going through it all again.
Lurching through.
In 6 months, a year time.
It's quite interesting. If you go backwards to the election, these fiscal rules came about that, commentators like yourself, Ed Balls, plenty of people have criticised the fiscal rules as boxing in Labour's space to manoeuvre. But I guess to give the Labour side of the argument, I think they believe that if the Tories had made a tax election, so remember Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt made tax cuts before the election, promised to cut more taxes as well afterwards, and Labour was saying, actually, in almost kind of a Cameron Knight Osborne way, it's going to be tough. We're going to actually have to raise taxes on you, but to pay for a bit of stuff, and maybe we'll hand over a few things like a 2-child benefit cap or whatever. Maybe if they change the strategy that way around. Do you think that Labour could have won a majority, because the distribution of the vote was so efficient, right? Was it like a 1.5% swing? You lose a majority in some of these marginal seats, right?
And there's at least 80 of them.
Yeah. So I mean, do you think that it was, McSweeney's gamble that this was the only way to win? Basically meant that, okay, you can win, you can be in government, but you're probably going to run up to all of these sorts of problems. It's going to kill you in the long term, or you would never win.
You're right that Labour strategists felt they had to do it to win. There's no way of testing that hypothesis. My argument at the time, and I still believe it, is they would have won anyway, and in fact could have won by more had they been able to make an argument that they would invest more money in services and undo the tax cuts that the Tories had just put through, and argue that they were not plausible and they were just an election bribe. I think that one of the problems with the Labour campaign and why it was so tight was because they didn't really have very much to say, because the campaign was just, we're not going to put up taxes, we're not going to do anything, we're just a safe pair of hands, but change. Like, a lot of people would have felt very uninspired by that campaign. So I think you could have done more if you were willing to take a few more risks, but it's easy for me to say because it wasn't my job on the line, it was Morgan McSweeney's job on the line. But it's certainly the case that in deciding to do what they did, they screwed themselves for government. They made it so much harder for themselves. It was always going to be the case that they were going to have to put taxes up because of the mess that Tories left the economy in. And by ruling out all of the taxes where we get the most revenue from, they were just always going to make it much harder for themselves. And I think it's such a cardinal error that so many parties make of just
short-termism,
of pure short-termism.
I was going to say, so what do you think the political or electoral consequences of all of this are? I mean, We've spoken about reform coming down the track, a government potentially just lurching its way forward. Do you see kind of the economic picture getting any better as a consequence of what Rachel Reeves may have to do? That could inspire some more confidence for that second term that I think the Labour Party is so desperate for.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the budget is going to do that. I mean, it might help a little bit if it reassures bond markets and brings down that sort of debt that we're paying. But on the whole, we're very dependent on international circumstances. Like, does the AI bubble burst?
Trump's tariffs.
What happens with Trump's tariffs? What happens
Ukraine.
in the Middle East? What happens with Ukraine? Like, there are things that could happen that would be positive, that would, help to build on what is a very fragile recovery in the economy at the moment. There are things that would make it a lot worse. It's just not a lot the government can do about it. We're in such a fragile position that we're very dependent on external events at the moment, as are governments across Europe. If things go in the right direction, then you could start to build on that and start to create the narrative you want. If you get whacked with another recession, it's going to be very, very difficult to find a way out. I think the May local elections are going to be really critical. I think both the Tories and Labour are going to do very badly if things don't change in some dramatic way before then. And that's going to be a moment where both parties, the members and MPs of both parties, look at their leadership and think,
this isn't it.
We're halfway through the term, not quite halfway through, but we're
what do we do?
A couple of years through this Parliament. If we're going to have change, this is the time to do it. Do the Tories get rid of Badenoch? Do Labour challenge Starmer? I think next summer is going to be a kind of really pivotal. Either way, it's going to be a pivotal moment in this Parliament where either you're going to get one or both parties trying to change leaders, or they're going to say, we've made our bet, we're going to stick with this lot through to the election.
Yeah.
It's going to be very interesting.
Do you think that country before party means doing something like having a really tough budget that maybe dents that specific leadership but creates a space for that party to still be able to inherit something worth fighting for?
I mean, the argument is it's country of party, but it's also for the sake of the party. Like, this is what I was trying to get to in the piece I wrote about it. The calculation you have to make if you're Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer right now is, if we just survive this and get through with the minimum level of fuss, but don't do anything about fixing any of the long-term problems, we're probably not going to be able to win an election, because we're going to get to 2029 and nothing's going to be any better. We'll have survived this one moment, but we haven't got anything to build on. But to do the riskier budget, to do the long-term stuff that might be unpopular now, might kill you now.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you trade off that need to survive the short term with the need to survive the long term? And there's no right answer to that. That's a gut judgment call as to how far you can go. But it's a real shame that Labour are already in such a fragile position that's the judgment call they have to make, rather than being in a sort of strong position where you can say, we need to do this sort of tough thing. We're going to use up our political capital now. They've already used up their political capital for nothing, and now they can't use it. Yeah. And now they can't use it when you need it.
Do you think this hampers the future of the Labour Party? I mean, what we've seen with the Tories is that they ran out of steam, largely probably from the previous Parliament to now, but they've got kind of a damaged reputation, especially around the economic. Yeah, exactly. And I wonder whether Labour has to make all of these considered and political decisions which inform the economic. Do you think there could be a time where, I mean, our generation, I think, are significantly more left-wing, and populism is an increasingly attractive alternative. Do you think it has consequences for the Labour Party in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Or do you think Labour can potentially resurface?
Obviously, who knows what's going to happen next week, let alone in 10 years' time. But what we can see is that the public, there's far less political loyalty than there used to be. People don't think of themselves, increasingly less likely to think of themselves as being attached to a party, their identity being attached to a party. Membership has dropped for Labour and the Tories hugely over a very long period of time. There's much more willingness to move around. So parties can't rely on a loyal base in the same way they could 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. And so if you do trash your brand, you don't have that kind of respite maybe the Tories had in 1997 or Labour had in 1979, where you're given quite a long time to recover, but you can still come back and win. If you trash your brand, that might be it now. It's much more existential, and you've got, the Greens pushing hard, you've got the Lib Dems doing quite well in the polls, new parties can emerge. We might end up having a PR system if the next election is up so messy that it's the only way of figuring out what if smaller parties are able to gang together and push that through. So, who knows? But it's certainly the case that you've got a lot less margin for error than you used to have, and we're seeing that with the Tories at the moment. And Labour could easily find themselves in that position.
It sounds though that you are very sceptical of an Andy Burnham type figure though for Labour in terms of. Sure, Burnham is a great communicator. Polls tell us as such. He's got that nice little sheen from being in the mayoral and being able to kind of plot that line.
And blame Westminster.
But ultimately, he said in his New Statesman piece, he didn't want the government to be in hock to the bond markets. But what does that actually mean, though, in practice?
I mean, this is the problem with, of course you can change leader. And Starmer is flawed as a leader, certainly. But it doesn't fix any of the problems by itself. They've got to have some actual solutions to problems that the current lot aren't doing. I mean, everything Burnham has said either isn't doable in the current economic circumstances or doesn't really address the problems that we have. I also think by moving so early and so aggressively, he's pissed off a lot of people and probably made it harder for himself.
That's why he kind of rode back at conference a bit. Yeah.
But do you not think there's a call for a renewed vision for social democracy, despite the limitations that we've just discussed? I mean, his reimagination as to what Manchesterism looks like and how society can be organised. Do you not think there's, to a point, popular appetite for something slightly different than just what
there's certainly an appetite for it. I'm just not convinced he can do it. I think what they've done in Manchester has been good. Although you can point to problems as well, but it's so different given the very limited powers he has as Manchester mayor and the small number of things that he's done compared to the decisions that you have to take running a country, and the scale of the challenge that as we've been talking about, every government in Europe is having at the moment. I don't see him having the solutions. I'm not sure anyone has the solutions to those problems. It's easy to say we need a better vision for social democracy, but what is it in a world where we are in hock to bond markets, whether we want to be or not, and where we're so financially constrained, and where there's so much anger about immigration, and it's not obvious.
No.
And every country is struggling with it. Probably Pedro Sanchez in Spain has been most successful at creating a sort of an alternative vision. But even he is not doing particularly well in the polls at the moment. So there's no obvious solution to this.
People look to him though as the kind of, they might be figuring out the new playbook, right? Communications wise, being very much of the left. They've done really effective stuff on energy policy, right, in terms of being able to lower bills through green energy, which is kind of the promise we made, but we haven't seen those green shoots yet.
Subsidising transport, the fact it's so much cheaper to get across Spain, and the train travel, despite nationalisation, is still so expensive in this country. So I think you're right, the rhetoric is emerging.
And the wealth tax, they did a wealth tax, even though it didn't raise...
It had a lot of holes in it.
Yeah, it had loads of holes in it, but they did it, I guess, almost like a communications exercise to a certain degree.
But the most important thing is they've had decent growth. They've had the best growth in Europe.
Yeah,
and
which has been facilitated by immigration, right?
Yeah. And this is so you go around in circles on this stuff. But they because they've had that growth, he's been able to do some of those policies, and he's been able to build a sort of narrative that's more of the left. We don't have that growth here. Until we get it, we can't do his playbook. No one could do his playbook. Burnham couldn't. Nobody could. So there might be advantages to changing leader. I do think Starmer's operation has been pretty dysfunctional. I think he's obviously not a great communicator, but it certainly doesn't begin to solve your fundamental problems.
Yeah.
And what do you think about house building? Because, again, broadening out the discussion and looking elsewhere, Canada, for instance, has made it specifically their whole politics is about building, right? Build. So we kind of came in with we had a similar sort of narrative going around. Obviously, Angela Rayner no longer with us, but that was kind of her brief. I mean, why do you think the government's not been able to cut through enough red tape to get building on steroids?
Well, firstly, the planning stuff hasn't actually happened yet. Like, the planning bill still is going through Parliament.
It's been watered down quite a bit, though.
It has been watered down a bit. There's still really good stuff in it, and when it goes through, it will make a difference. And you are starting to see a difference from the fact they've sort of put targets back on local authorities. And they can start to put pressure on local authorities to build more housing. So it's not like they haven't done anything. Part of the issue is, as I said, the stuff hasn't actually happened yet. But another issue is, you have to think about housing. There's a supply issue and there's a demand issue. You have to have enough houses, and we don't. But you also have to have demand for new property, because otherwise, if you don't, developers won't build it because they can't sell it. Interest rates are high, mortgages are difficult for people to afford. So you don't actually have the demand there at the moment. And so developers aren't... Even if they can get planning permission, they're not building. So you can make it easier to get planning permission, and we certainly should do that. And you could go further than the current bill goes. But unless you have that demand, you're not actually going to get developers building those houses. So you have to think about both. And again, until interest rates come down, which they're not going to come probably for the rest of this year, and until mortgages are more accessible to people, we're going to have a problem.
Right.
And materials. I mean...
Builders,
yeah.
Yes, and construction,
which
takes us back to immigration.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard it's easier and cheaper for us to import cement from Egypt than it is for us to make cement here in the UK.
Probably true.
So there's a crisis not just around the ability to build houses, but the literal things you need to build the houses is...
Yeah, so the cost the cost of even if you did the most radical planning reforms imaginable, it wouldn't bring down the cost of housing that much, because there are so many other costs attached to it. Yes, planning, absolutely. I'm totally YIMBY, but it can't be the only thing that you're thinking about when it comes to the housing market. Social housing is different because the government are paying for those houses, so you're not dependent on developers wanting to build it, and there's huge demand for social housing, massive backlog. So you could put more money into social housing, or bring the money they've put in social housing forward. There's obviously a cost to doing that. That would help a bit. It also means you keep labour, you keep construction workers busy so they don't go off and do something else. It stops it being such a cyclical industry. There's a value in investing more in social housing as part of an overall plan. But yeah, it's fundamentally you need people to be able to afford to buy.
In your view, then, are house prices only going to continue to appreciate in years to come?
I mean, they've been pretty flat the last few years. And I think they'll probably stay fairly flat for a little while. The market isn't, because there isn't actually that much demand at the moment. The market it is a pretty flat market. But to bring prices down seriously, you'd have to both ramp up supply a lot and see the costs of construction and materials and mortgages all come down.
Right, which is probably
not
going to happen.
I mean, it sounds like, Sam, we've kind of diagnosed a number of intractable problems over the course of the last hour and a half. It sounds like what we're after is some sort of leader who really understands the diagnostics of the state, of like the inner workings of government and politics, to kind of come in whilst also being able to harness some of that popular anger through some form of populisty style messaging for the digital media environment. I kind of don't really see that figure anywhere.
No, I agree with you. It's very difficult to do, and it's getting increasingly difficult. How do you balance an honest assessment of our problems with a world in which people want simple answers? And I don't know what the answer is to that. I see my kids. They start. I've got 15-year-old twins. They're starting to think more and more about politics. I talk to them a lot, but they
come from good stock as well.
But they look at TikTok and their TikTok feed is just full of either very simple Farage is evil, or Farage doing saying what he wants to say, and it's all
wealth tax that solves everything.
Wealth tax, it's all very simple, like 10-second solutions to stuff, and that's not how the world works. And the world of communications is moving more and more towards that way of thinking. So it's very difficult to be someone who can communicate in that world, but also but is able to do so in a way that acknowledges the complexity of it. And I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did.
Finally, can we ask you what gives you at least a bit of hope for what's left of our society and our institutions?
What gives me hope? What gives me hope is that ultimately we've been in worse places before and we've come out of it. Like sometimes you have to get to a really dark place in order for people to realise what they're going to lose or what they've lost. But it was pretty grim in the early 70s. It was very grim in the Second World War and after the Second World War, and we built stronger societies out of that. I fear that we are going to things are going to get worse before they get better, but I do think ultimately that people will see that the radical right don't have any answers to any of these problems either, and there will be an opportunity for people who do want to do the right thing to rebuild.
So your hopeful message is things are going to get a lot worse.
Things are going to get worse, but then they will get better.
Well, the march of human history is forwards.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, Sam, thank you so much. I feel like we've answered so many questions that we've had on our minds.
Enlightened. I feel enlightened having spoken to you.
And definitely we've got a long shelf life of this one in terms of the predictions that we've got looking forward.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.